Okay, so I am going to cover my Dev 2 implementation because it's different this semester than I've done it past. And I want to go over it to give you an example of how to approach this if you want to take the first option for Dev 2. And in this case, I've updated this to say you need to do the create and the read and the delete, but you can drop the U, which is the update, and you'll see why in my case I had to. You still have to validate user input. If you do want to do something like this, right, but you want to use a different topic, I definitely say, talk to me and know that you need to meet the requirements of Dev 1. But I suspect most of you who are going to take this option will take your Dev 1. Okay, and there's my suggestion. I did a little bit of documentation today as I walked through the process and I'm doing this right after because I want to have it be fresh in my mind. Because it did take me a little bit of like thinking about it because in the past I've handled this differently, and this semester I decided to actually approach it in a different way. So I suggest using a class for the user input and then a different class for handling the storage. Because here's the thing you can know is that when we implement OOP, when we implement classes and substantiate objects, we're basically just creating objects. We lose when we save it into local storage. Now, this is not local storage, but when you save it into local storage like we did for Dev 1, it loses that connection to the class and therefore the prototypes, or sorry, therefore the methods. Okay. So I just want you to know that. And so let me just start covering it rather than to talk about it even more. So here's my few notes is first, and I definitely recommend doing it this way, is remove local storage code. Right. So anywhere in your code where you were saving to local storage or bringing it back from local storage, which means we're no longer having what we call persistent data. It is only going to be as the browser is open, which is why the U part of CRUD is going to be lost, which is fine. But here's the key. Go through, and this really is good because it makes you really look at that code again and realize where are you using local storage. And this took me a few minutes, but one thing I did is I just commented out first, just commented out those calls. And then once I had working code, and that is the key, is you need working code before you start moving on to the next parts of this. Okay. So once you have that, then, remove the comments, because what I ended up doing, and you're actually going to be able to see this code in the clear, is I'm putting it under the public, under demo, under dev_2. I haven't pushed it yet, but I will by the time you see this video. Okay, so I want you to know that. So basically now you're going to create a class. And so what I did in my app.js, right, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, is in my event listener from my main form is where I create the object. I just called new, and this is my class, the suggestion. Okay, so where is that? It's actually, and I created a new file called classes, and in it I have my suggestion. Okay. Now I'm not going to go through that detail. I don't know. I guess I could, but the point is that your code is doing something a little different. So it may or may not be helpful to see mine. But I'll tell you, and I'll just drop it here, is I set up some values on my class. Okay. I passed in of course, some of the values from the form. And then I ended up writing two methods to then process that data, right? Because that was the idea. The thing we're doing differently than the notes and the to-dos is we're actually processing this data in some way. Okay, so, and the key here is you have to understand how to do this, right? How to reference this, which we have already learned in this class. So this is not completely new, but substantiating these objects is. So over here, right? So I created that new object by calling new, passing in those things. And then I called process suggestion, which is one of my methods on there. And then I actually had to think about now, once you have that object and where we have saved it in an array of objects, I created a different class to handle that because this object, this new suggestion is really only a class intended for each submission of the form. Okay. And actually, I should probably call it just input. That would actually have been a better name for it. But, anytime you name something, you can come back around and go, a better name. But at this point, once I process that, I call that method, which is on that new instantiated object. Then I'm going to actually create another, or I'm going to use another class. Now, this class over here is, and I'm going to roll this back up so you don't have to look at all of this. There's my constructor. I can roll this up. That's my new my two processes. I'll just roll that up, roll that up, roll that up. So then what I ended up doing is I created another class called data store, which, by the way, this is a fairly common name, so it actually is not quite indicative of what it is, but in this case it acts like. And all I did here is I set up an empty array. Sorry, yeah, an empty array. Okay, so and then I wrote the methods to handle creating the DOM, right? Creating my divs, all of that I put here. Okay, so essentially what I ended up doing with these two classes was I ended up separating out my functions into their more logically associated um, function. So one of my classes is for handling like what we'd kind of done with where we saved the data and then we rendered it into the DOM. To me, made more sense being in the data store. And then where we process the input, these things made more sense in the suggestions. Okay, for me, that class. Again, it's going to look different from you, but ultimately, and by the way, here's what I definitely say: do this in stages, because if you try to do this all in once, I don't think I could have done this if I had tried this in all one sweep. So I created the class to handle the user input. I created a new JS file for the code, right? I created two methods, right? And then uh, this step did break, and that was the key. And I'll just show you this. Let me go ahead and run my output. Again, you can see this if you want on your own. But here's the output. So it still works, which is great. And by the way, I can't emphasize enough the importance of testing, testing, testing. When you do code, when you're doing this kind of refactoring, it is really important that you understand, don't make too many changes before you start testing. Okay. So my code, I'm just going to show you. This is the OOP version, the dev 2 example. And if I hit Monday, it works. It outputs what I wanted it to, which is great, right? And then, but what will happen, and I can do another one just to show you, it does, and yours should render at least a couple of form entries so you can see that. Submit it again, right? But what will happen, and actually I think I could have fixed this, but when I go to rate the suggestion, right? What happens is it leaves that page. And if I go over here and try to put in something, it actually at this point, now this may not be true for you based on the way you handle it. For me, I lose that, which is fine. So this will be weird though when you do it. It'll be like, why is it losing it? Well, it's intended to be because you're removing the local storage code, right? So hope that it makes sense. But ultimately what I did was, and I could now remove my functions out of my my file. This is no longer needed because everything, and this is what I do, is as I get something working, then I comment it out, because basically what I'm doing, like the render reality quality check, was under the data store. I ended up having to do very little modification to that. Other ones I had to do more to. But in that case, right, this is now the method that handles that part. Sorry, here it is. This is the part that handles that this is the method that now used to be that function. Okay, so the other thing I want to show you here is that what this looked like too was like my UUID was setting here. And just to show you, I'm not joking about this, like I could actually now remove that and my program should still run perfectly fine, because in the process, that's what I ended up getting rid of, was I refactored it all to use a class and it still works. Okay, so let me go back to the documentation. So first I did that. Created a class to handle the user input, and then I created a class to handle the data store. Now, one of the things I did to make my life a little easier, that when you see my code may not make sense, is right here in the app.js. Perfect. Let me bring it over here to this side and just drop this for a second so it's not taking up so much. One of the things I did is on page load, that's when I created my new data store. Okay. And then what I ended up doing, because I wanted to not have to modify all the times I passed around this morning task, because in the prior version, in the version that, and by the way, I took my decision code, which you're not doing, you're taking your dev one. But I just did this to my decision code to give you a little more concise example. But in this case, I ended up referencing the data store array of objects, which is basically what happens when I create that new data store. It creates that empty, and I called it an array of objects. But the reason in the app.js, I ended up saying, you know what, that instantiated object property called array of objects being an empty array is really from now on, unless I need it otherwise, going to be called morning task. So that way, anytime I reference that in my code, it worked. The only place that didn't work is on page load. I needed it actually to call when I wanted to call the render method, and actually it worked here. And I actually could have tried that here. Actually, let's try that here. Maybe I didn't. No, that's right. See how I called it? Yeah. See, I just wrote a little while ago and I forgot. So I referenced data store, render, suggestion, morning task. And and he actually talks about this, because this is in the global space, you actually don't have to pass this around. But because all of my code was already handling that, I decided to make it easier for myself. So I actually could make this even cleaner a few steps more. Okay, I hope this gives you some insight into how I refactored my code for Dev 2. Uh, but again, I did it based on the suggestion code because it was a little more concise. What you'll be doing is actually a bit more involved, and that's why I'm recommending you take this one step at a time. Do not recode the whole thing, and know that you will lose the edit or the update ability of CRUD, which is totally fine, and you do not get marked off for that. Okay, later I'll actually do another example here, but for now, I wanted to do that before we head into break. Okay, thanks. Bye.